The chandelier light caught the ring on her hand before it caught his face. Margaret Whitmore stood in the center of her own birthday party, fingers laced through a stranger's calloused ones, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when money smells a threat. Her mother's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Her father's jaw tightened. Richard Voss did not blink. "Mom, Dad." Maggie's voice did not shake, though her hand did. "This is my fiancé." Ethan Calder, in a rented suit 2 sizes wrong, searched the crowd for his daughter's face. Nobody in that room knew his name a year ago. By the time this story ends, they will wish they never had to. The silence lasted 4 seconds, which is a long time when 200 people are holding their breath at once. Patricia Whitmore set her glass down without drinking from it, her hand betraying nothing while her eyes betrayed everything. Walter Whitmore, a man who had shaken hands with senators without flinching, looked at the calluses on Ethan's palm and said nothing at all. A string quartet in the corner kept playing, oblivious, until someone finally waved them into silence. It was Richard Voss who moved first, stepping forward with the smile of a man who had already decided how this evening would end. "Margaret, perhaps introductions can wait until after the toasts." He did not look at Ethan. He looked past him. The way people look past furniture that has wandered somewhere it does not belong. A few guests laughed nervously, the kind of laugh that fills silence rather than expresses joy, and the string quartet resumed a beat too eagerly. 9 months earlier, none of this had existed. Maggie had walked into a boatyard on the working edge of Casco Bay because her father's sailboat had taken on water during a September storm, and the marina office had recommended a man who did not advertise and did not need to. She had expected sawdust and grease and had gotten both, along with a 9-year-old girl sitting cross-legged on a workbench painting a model schooner, the exact shade of blue as the real one leaking in the slip outside. "That's Lily," Ethan had said, not looking up from the hull he was sanding. "She'll ask you 40 questions before you leave. I apologize in advance." Lily had asked 31. Maggie counted, mostly to keep from crying in front of a stranger, because it had been longer than she wanted to admit since anyone had asked her anything that wasn't about quarterly earnings or shareholder confidence. "Where do you live? Do you have a dog? Why does your coat cost more than our truck?" She had answered every one, and Ethan had said nothing, only smiled once at the ceiling like a man remembering something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. At the party, Lily stood near the raw bar in a dress 2 sizes too formal for a 9-year-old, watching her father's face for a sign of what to do next. She did not run to him. She had been told, gently, that grown-up rooms sometimes needed grown-up silence, and she was trying hard to be brave about it, her small hands twisting the hem of her dress until the fabric wrinkled. Voss took Maggie's elbow with the practiced grip of a man used to steering rooms without asking permission. "A word," he said, and it was not a request. He walked her toward the terrace doors, past guests who suddenly found their drinks fascinating, past her own mother, who watched them go and did not intervene. "You cannot do this tonight of all nights," Voss said once they were alone, the harbor wind pulling at his jacket. "The board meets in 3 weeks, Margaret. Shareholders do not respond well to surprises, especially ones wearing rented shoes and no last name anyone recognizes. His shoes are his business. His shoes are the company's business the moment your name is attached to his." Voss's voice softened, which was somehow worse than when it hardened. "I promised your grandfather I would look after this family's interests when he was too tired to look after them himself. I intend to keep that promise, Margaret, whether or not you make it easy for me." "You've kept a great many promises to my grandfather," Maggie said. "I sometimes wonder how many of them were actually his." Voss's expression flickered, just once, before smoothing back into practiced calm. "Careful," he said quietly. "That kind of talk finds its way into rooms it shouldn't." Inside, Ethan found Lily by the raw bar and crouched to her height, ignoring the stares from 3 different directions. "You did good, kiddo. Real good." "Is she going to be my mom now?" Lily asked, too loud, in the way children ask the questions adults spend hours avoiding. A few heads turned. A woman near the ice sculpture actually gasped, delighted, the way people are delighted by other families' complications. Ethan did not flinch. "She's going to be exactly what she wants to be, on her own time. That's how it works with people worth waiting for. Grandma Eleanor said the same thing about you once. When I asked if you'd ever smile again, Ethan's throat worked once before he answered. Grandma Eleanor's a smart woman. He gathered his daughter's coat within the hour, said his goodbyes to no one in particular, and left through the kitchen entrance rather than the front, because front entrances invited photographs and he had learned, a long time ago, the value of not being photographed. Maggie watched him go from the terrace, Voss's hand still resting on her arm like a leash disguised as concern, and said nothing, because there was nothing yet worth saying that wouldn't make things worse for the man who had just walked out into the cold alone with his daughter's hand in his. Richard Voss did not waste time. Within a week he had a private investigator's report on his desk, thin as the man had described. Ethan Calder, 41. Widower. Sole proprietor of a boat repair shop on the working end of the harbor. No college listed, no family money, no criminal record, which annoyed Voss more than one would have expected. A dead wife, 6 years gone. Cause of death listed simply as illness. A daughter enrolled at the local elementary school under a partial scholarship. Nothing that explained why a woman like Margaret Whitmore had chosen a man like this over the string of appropriate suitors who had orbited her for a decade. "There's nothing here," Voss said to the empty office, tossing the folder aside, and for a moment something like unease crossed his face before he mastered it. His daughter-in-law to be, had things gone according to plan, would have been someone else entirely. Voss's son Trevor was supposed to have married into this family 2 years ago, before Maggie had quietly, firmly declined, citing nothing more specific than a feeling in her chest that told her the arrangement would cost her something she couldn't name. The company's bylaws tied certain voting shares to marriages made within a generation of the founding family, an old and eccentric provision Walter Whitmore's grandfather had written into the trust to keep outsiders from buying their way into control during a hostile takeover attempt decades earlier. Voss had spent a decade positioning Trevor as the safe, sanctioned outsider, patient the way men are patient when they believe time is on their side. Ethan Calder was not part of that plan, and Voss did not tolerate things that were not part of his plan. Across town, Eleanor Whitmore sat in the sunroom of her house, with a cup of Earl Grey going cold, and a stack of photographs from Maggie's party spread across her lap. She was 74 years old, moved slower since a fall on the porch steps the previous winter, and trusted almost nobody in this family's orbit except her housekeeper of 19 years, Carol Doyle, who was at that moment dusting a bookshelf and pretending not to listen, though her ears had pricked the moment Eleanor's voice changed tone. "Carol, bring me the box from the attic." The one marked Harbor Authority, 1990 through 2008. Carol raised an eyebrow but did not ask why. She had learned in 19 years that Eleanor's instincts were worth the climb up a ladder, and that questions asked too early only slowed the answer down. The box, when it came, smelled of dust and old paper and something faintly of salt, as though the harbor itself had seeped into the cardboard over the decades. Eleanor sorted through dry dock schematics and shipping manifests until she found what she had been chasing since she saw the photograph of a certain young man's hands at the party, broad and scarred and precise, in a way that had nothing to do with sanding hulls for a living. 12 years ago, Whitmore Marine had nearly gone under when its aging dry dock system failed inspection twice in one season, threatening contracts that would have sunk the family business for good. A Navy engineering team had come in on a joint contract with the Harbor Authority, redesigned the entire load-bearing structure in 4 months, and vanished back into the service without ceremony or thanks, because that was simply what the job required. The lead engineer's name on every blueprint was listed only as Lieutenant E. Calder, United States Navy Civil Engineer Corps. Eleanor set the blueprint down slowly, the way people set down things they are afraid of dropping. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age this time, but from the particular vertigo of watching 2 separate parts of her life fold suddenly into one. She said nothing to Carol. She said nothing to Maggie. She sat with it a long while. An old woman with a bad hip and a secret that could either save her granddaughter's happiness or detonate it entirely, depending on when and how it was told, and to whom. That evening, down at the harbor, Ethan sat on the edge of the dock with his boots off and his feet in the cold water, and Maggie found him there without calling first. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long time neither of them said anything because the silence between them had stopped being awkward months ago and started being a kind of language they had built together, word by unspoken word. "I used to build things bigger than boats," Ethan said finally, watching the harbor lights flicker on the black water. He did not elaborate. She did not ask him to. It was the first true thing he had told her about his past, and it was small enough to be safe and large enough to matter, and that was exactly how much he was ready to give her that night. Bigger how? She asked anyway, gently, the way you nudge a door that isn't locked but hasn't opened yet either. Bigger the way things get when a lot of people's livelihoods are riding on whether the math is right. He looked at her sideways. Someday. Not tonight. Okay, she said, and meant it, and rested her head against his shoulder while the harbor lights kept flickering, patient as they had always been. Voss called his son from his car that same night, engine idling in the dark driveway of his house. We need to move the timeline up, he said, low, urgent, his knuckles pale on the steering wheel. This thing has gone further than I planned for. Before it gets out of hand, I want it handled. Trevor's voice crackled back through the speaker, uneasy in a way that suggested he had never fully believed his father's confidence to begin with. Handled how, exactly? You said the shares would come to me either way once she married someone appropriate. What happens if she just doesn't? However it needs to be, Voss said, and ended the call before his son could ask a second time, before Trevor could hear the small crack of doubt that had crept into his own voice. The pressure did not wait for daylight. At Sunday dinner 3 days later, Walter Whitmore set down his fork with the deliberate calm of a man about to say something he had rehearsed in the mirror that morning. Margaret, your mother and I have discussed this. The board has questions about your judgment. Voss has questions. If you intend to keep your position as chief executive and your seat on this family's trust, certain choices need to be reconsidered. You mean Ethan needs to be reconsidered? I mean this family built something over 3 generations that does not survive on sentiment, Patricia said gently, in the voice she used when she wanted cruelty to sound like love, refilling her water glass without looking up. We are not asking you to stop caring for him. We are asking you to be practical about how visible that caring is. Maggie did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that raising her voice in this house only proved their point, gave them something to point at later as evidence of instability. I have been practical for 37 years. I would like, once in my life, to be something else. Being something else is a luxury this family has never been able to afford, Walter said, and immediately looked as though he wished he could take the sentence back because it was true, and because he had heard his own father say nearly the same words to him once, decades ago, about a woman he still occasionally thought of. Across the harbor that same evening, Ethan's phone rang from a blocked number. A man's voice, unfamiliar, flat and unhurried, told him to stay away from Whitmore Marine Holdings if he knew what was good for him and his daughter, and then the line went dead before Ethan could ask a single question. He stood in his workshop a long moment, the phone warm in his hand, and did not tell Maggie. He told himself it was nothing, a bluff, the kind of thing scared men say when they have run out of better ideas. He checked the lock on his shop door twice that night, which was once more than usual, and once more than he wanted to admit. Lily found him at the kitchen table afterward, staring at nothing, a mug of coffee gone cold in front of him. You haven't smiled since the party, she said, climbing into the chair across from him with the directness only a 9-year-old could manage without cruelty. Smiling's overrated some weeks, kiddo. He reached across and squeezed her hand. Don't worry about the grown-up stuff. That's my job. It's supposed to be both our jobs. You said families share the hard parts. You said that after Mom, when I asked if I was allowed to be sad too. He had said that. He had meant it about homework and grief and the particular loneliness of a house with one fewer chair at the table, not about billion-dollar family trusts and men who called from blocked numbers, but he supposed a promise didn't come with fine print just because the circumstances changed shape around it. Fair enough, he said, managing something close to a real smile this time. I'll try to smile more. Deal, deal, Lily said, and held out her hand to shake on it, solemn as a judge. 2 days later, Voss found Ethan at a diner 2 blocks from the boatyard, sliding into the booth across from him without invitation, the vinyl seat squeaking under his weight. He placed an envelope on the table between them, thick enough to mean something, thick enough that the waitress refilling coffee 2 tables over glanced at it twice. $200,000, Voss said, folding his hands. Enough to expand your little shop, put your daughter through any school in the state, disappear from this family's life with your dignity intact. Nobody has to know this conversation happened. You go back to your boats, I go back to my board, and everyone gets to keep what actually matters to them." Ethan looked at the envelope for a long moment, then at the man who had placed it there, then pushed it back across the table with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate. "You can't buy the parts of me that matter to her," he said, quiet and even, not a flicker of anger in it, which seemed to unsettle Voss more than rage would have. "And you can't buy the parts of her that already decided a long time before you found out my name." Voss's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Some small recalibration. "Then I'll find another way," he said, standing, leaving the envelope where it lay on the formica table between the ketchup and the sugar packets. "I always do." That night, the rain came in off the Atlantic the way it does in Maine in early autumn, sideways and cold and unrelenting against the tin roof of the workshop. Maggie drove to the harbor without calling ahead, parked crooked, and walked into Ethan's workshop soaked through, saying nothing about why she'd come or what had happened at dinner 2 nights before. He didn't ask. He handed her a rag, and she sat beside him at the workbench while he sanded down Lily's model schooner, and for an hour, the only sounds were rain on the tin roof and sandpaper on wood, and occasionally, the low creak of the building settling into the storm. "He offered you money," Maggie said eventually. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah. You didn't take it." "No." She reached over and wiped a smear of dust from his jaw with her thumb, an unthinking, small gesture, and neither of them made anything larger of it than it was. That was the shape their whole relationship had taken from the beginning. Nothing declared, everything understood, love conjugated entirely in the passive voice of small gestures neither of them ever named out loud. "They're going to try to take the company from me," she said finally, watching the sandpaper move in slow circles. "Not outright. Boss is smarter than that. He'll do it a vote at a time, a rumor at a time, until there's nothing left for me to fight for. Then we fight a vote at a time, and a rumor at a time," Ethan said, not looking up. "I've done slower work than that." Eleanor, meanwhile, had begun her own quiet investigation, the kind an old woman with a bad hip conducts from an armchair with a telephone and a housekeeper who does not ask unnecessary questions. She had Carol drive her to the harbor, under the pretense of having her old sailboat inspected, and while Ethan measured the hull with a tape and a level, Eleanor watched his hands sign a work order in handwriting. She recognized instantly from the margins of a blueprint sitting in a box in her attic, and the same slant, the same habit of crossing his sevens in the European style he must have picked up somewhere in his training. She said nothing. She paid for the inspection in cash and left, her mind working faster than her legs had in years, already 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the family. Richard Voss called an emergency session of the board the following week, framing it as a matter of corporate image rather than personal interference, though everyone in the room understood exactly what it was and exactly whose interference it represented. "Our chief executive's judgment has come into question through a relationship that exposes this company to reputational risk," he told the assembled directors, most of whom had known Maggie since she was a child, and looked uncomfortable saying so out loud in a room with recording devices. "I move that we consider a temporary reassignment of operational authority pending review of the matter." Maggie stood, steady despite the ground shifting beneath her, her hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. "I have run this company for 6 years without a single missed earnings target, Richard. I've closed 3 acquisitions and turned a division you told my grandfather to sell into our most profitable line. My personal life is not a line item on your balance sheet." "Your personal life," Voss said, unmoved, "became a line item the moment it became public." A murmur moved through the boardroom, some directors nodding faintly with Voss, others glancing uneasily at Walter, who sat at the head of the table with his hands folded and his expression carefully unreadable. The vote was tabled, not defeated, which in a boardroom is its own kind of threat. A blade left resting against the throat, rather than removed from the room entirely. Walter Whitmore, watching from his seat, said nothing during the meeting, but that evening, he sat alone in his study long after Patricia had gone to bed, turning over the memory of his daughter's steady voice and wondering, for the first time in years, whether steadiness was worth more than he'd given it credit for his entire career. Down at the harbor, Ethan felt the pressure without knowing its exact shape. He saw it in the way Maggie's calls grew shorter, in the tired set of her shoulders when she visited, in the careful way she avoided saying what exactly the board had discussed. He wondered, alone at night after Lily was asleep, whether loving her meant costing her everything she'd spent her life building, whether the kindest thing he could do was the very thing Voss had offered to pay him for. He did not say this to her. He said it to the hull of an old sailboat instead, sanding it long after it needed sanding, because some thoughts are easier to survive with your hands busy than your mouth open. Eleanor made her decision on a Tuesday, the kind of gray Portland Tuesday that made the harbor look like an old photograph of itself. She had Carol bring the car around, and together the two women drove to the small brick house Maggie kept near downtown, rather than the family estate, a detail Eleanor had always privately admired her granddaughter for, evidence of a stubbornness that ran in the family whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. That same afternoon, in a house across town, Carol had noticed something during her usual grocery run for the Voss household, a small errand she still ran out of decades-old habit, despite officially working for Eleanor now, the two families' domestic lives having tangled together over the years the way old Portland families' lives tend to do. A folder had been left carelessly on the Voss kitchen counter, Trevor's laptop bag open beside it, papers half spilling out onto the granite. A single page had slid halfway free, the kind that meant nothing to most people and everything to the right ones. A wire transfer statement bearing a company letterhead Carol recognized immediately. Carol was not a woman who read other people's mail as a habit, but the amount on that page, and the account it was routed to, made her stop breathing for a moment in the middle of a stranger's kitchen. She photographed it with her phone before she could talk herself out of it, tucked the phone back into her coat pocket, and said nothing to anyone until she reached Eleanor's car, where her hands were still shaking slightly as she turned the key. Eleanor studied the photograph in silence for a long moment once Carol showed her, then looked up at Maggie's front door with something like resolve settling into her tired face, the particular resolve of a woman who has spent 74 years learning exactly when silence stops being useful. "Bring the blueprint from my bag," she told Carol, "and bring my coat. It's cold, and I suspect this conversation will take a while." Inside, Eleanor set both pieces of evidence on Maggie's kitchen table without preamble, the 12-year-old blueprint bearing the name Lieutenant E. Calder in faded blue ink, and the photograph of a wire transfer routing company funds through a shell account traced, according to the header, to Trevor Voss. "Your fiance," Eleanor said, watching her granddaughter's face carefully, "saved this family's company before either of us knew his name, and Richard Voss has been stealing from it for years to fund the life he wants his son to have. I'd wager the two of you didn't know either fact when you fell for him, which tells me something worth knowing about how you fell in the first place." Maggie sat down hard, both pieces of paper trembling slightly in her hands as she read them twice, then a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less enormous. "He never told me. Perhaps he had his reasons," Eleanor said, folding her hands over the head of her cane. "Perhaps you should ask him instead of me." Maggie drove to the harbor that night with the blueprint on the passenger's seat, headlights cutting through the same kind of rain that had brought her here once before, and found Ethan in the workshop exactly where he always was, exactly where he had been every time she'd needed him to be for 9 months now. She placed the blueprint on the workbench between them without a word, and watched his face change as he recognized it. He looked at it a long moment before he spoke, running one finger along the edge of the paper the way a man touches something he thought he'd buried for good. "I wondered how long it would take someone to find that. Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" "Because I didn't want you to love the engineer," Ethan said, quiet, steady, the words costing him something visible in the set of his jaw. "The Navy gave me rank and a paycheck and a project I finished in 4 months, and never thought about again. Not once, not even the day my wife got sick, and I realized none of it mattered as much as I'd been told it would. I wanted you to love the father who fixes boats and burns dinner twice a week, and doesn't have a single impressive thing to offer you except that he shows up every single day, whether it's easy or not. That's the man I actually am now. The other one died a long time ago, along with a lot of other things I don't talk about." Maggie crossed the small space between them and took his hand, holding it longer than the moment strictly required, longer than either of them needed to say anything else, the workshop lights humming overhead, and the rain still coming down outside. "I'm not disappointed in you," she said finally. "I just wish you'd trusted me sooner." "I trusted you with everything that mattered," he said. "I was just slow handing over the parts that didn't." The rain had stopped outside by the time she left. Neither of them mentioned it. Eleanor's health had not fully recovered from the fall the previous winter, and the stairs to the boardroom's private floor had become, in recent months, more of an obstacle than she cared to admit even to Carol. But she made the climb the following week anyway, leaning on Carol's arm the entire way, pausing twice to catch her breath on the landing because some conversations could not be conducted by phone and would not wait for her hip to improve. She met with Walter first, alone, in his study, the same room where Ethan would sit days later. She told him everything: the blueprint, the shell account, the years Richard Voss had spent quietly bleeding the company he claimed to be protecting, while positioning his own son to inherit what remained. Walter listened without interrupting, his face moving through several expressions before settling on something that looked, to Eleanor, uncomfortably like shame. 12 years, he said finally, staring at nothing. "The man saved us and we never even learned his name. We threw him a contractor's fee and a handshake from someone in procurement, and never once asked who signed the drawings." "You're learning it now," Eleanor said. "The question is what you intend to do with the knowledge, and how much longer you intend to let Richard Voss decide what this family is allowed to know about itself." Ethan made his own decision that same week, one Maggie had not asked him to make, and did not know was coming until it was already underway. He drove to the Whitmore estate alone, without a rented suit this time, in the same work jacket he wore to the shop every day, sawdust still faintly visible on the cuffs, and asked to see Walter Whitmore directly, refusing the offer to wait in a separate sitting room like a vendor with an appointment. He brought the original blueprint set he'd kept in a box in his attic for 12 years, the ones with his own handwritten calculations still visible in the margins, ink gone slightly brown with age. "I'm not here to ask for your blessing to prove I'm worthy of it," Ethan told him, standing in the same study where Walter had sat with Eleanor days before, the harbor visible through the window behind him. "Your daughter already decided that a long time ago, and I respect her enough not to hide from you anymore, whatever that costs me. I came because I think you deserve to know the truth before Richard Voss decides what version of it you hear next." Walter looked at the blueprints spread across his own desk, then at the man standing across from him, unyielding but not hostile, and for the first time saw not a boat mechanic in a rented suit but the quiet, deliberate engineer who had once rebuilt his family's future from a stack of failing steel, and never once asked for credit or thanks. "Sit down, Mr. Calder," Walter said, his voice rougher than usual. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss, and I find I owe you an apology before we begin." Richard Voss, sensing the ground shifting beneath him faster than he could control it, made his final move 3 days later. He called a press conference under the banner of corporate transparency, standing before local business reporters at a downtown hotel with the practiced calm of a man who had rehearsed his own righteousness in a mirror that morning. He accused Ethan Calder, by name, of exploiting a vulnerable young executive for financial gain, of hiding a military record to manipulate his way into a fortune, of being exactly the kind of opportunist the board had warned about all along, his voice rising with manufactured indignation for the cameras. Maggie stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, and when Voss finished speaking, she walked to the podium without being invited, a folder in her hand and Walter's quiet nod from the front row behind her. "Mr. Voss has raised questions about honesty today," she said, her voice carrying clean across the room, steadier than she felt. "So let's discuss honesty." She laid out the wire transfers one by one. Projected onto a screen, a staffer wheeled in on her signal. The shell account, the years of diverted funds routed through his son's name, his documents the board's own independent auditors had confirmed that very morning after Walter Whitmore quietly authorized the review himself 2 days earlier. Eleanor rose from her seat near the front, leaning on her cane, and addressed the room directly, her voice thinner than it once was but carrying nonetheless. 12 years ago, this company nearly collapsed. A young Navy engineer redesigned our entire dry dock system in 4 months and asked for nothing in return before returning to his post, because that was simply the job. His name was on every blueprint. His name is Ethan Calder. She held up the original document, her hand steady despite everything else about her that had grown less so with age. This company owes this man a debt it never knew it had. I would ask this room to consider, carefully, which of these two men has actually been hiding something worth being ashamed of. The room erupted into questions Voss could not answer fast enough to matter. Reporters shouting over one another. Cameras swinging toward the projection screen still glowing behind Maggie. Within the hour, the board had suspended him pending a formal investigation, and Trevor Voss, cornered by reporters outside the hotel, offered no comment before disappearing into a waiting car, his father's confidence nowhere in his face. Ethan stood near the back the entire time, saying nothing, hands in his jacket pockets, because the truth had finally started speaking for itself, and he found he did not need to add to it. Lily, who had been brought by a family friend to watch from a safe distance near the door, broke free the moment the crowd began to part and ran the length of the room, throwing her arms around her father's waist before he could stop her, then reaching for Maggie's hand a moment later without being told to, small fingers closing around Maggie's without hesitation. That evening, alone in his office at the estate, Walter Whitmore sat with the original blueprint spread across his desk, running his thumb along the faded ink of a signature that had waited 12 years to be recognized properly. He did not hear Patricia come in behind him until she set a hand on his shoulder. When she asked, gently, what he was looking at, he did not answer for a long moment, and when he did, his voice was rougher than she remembered it being in years. "The man who saved everything my father built," he said. "And I let Richard Voss nearly cost us the one thing that actually made it worth saving." The Whitmores hosted a dinner the following week, small and unannounced to the press, in the same dining room where Maggie had once been told her personal life was a line item on a balance sheet. This time there were place settings that mattered more than the china. Walter, Patricia, Eleanor, and across from them, Ethan and Lily, invited not as a concession or a public relations decision, but as family, plainly and without qualification. Walter stood when Ethan arrived, crossing the room to shake his hand with a grip that meant something different than it had the first and only time they'd stood in the same room before. 12 years too late, he said. "But thank you for saving what my father built, and for not letting me chase you off before I understood what I was chasing away." "You don't owe me thanks for a job I was paid to do," Ethan said, "but I'll take the dinner invitation and the apology if that's what that was." "It was," Walter said, almost smiling. Eleanor watched the exchange from her seat with quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from being right about something that mattered more than she'd let anyone see. Later, after the plates had been cleared, she pulled Lily aside and pressed a small wrapped box into her hands. Inside was the original model schooner Ethan had first sanded down in his shop the day Maggie walked in 9 months earlier. Restored and repainted now, with 2 names carved gently into the stern beneath the one Lily had painted there herself in memory of her mother's name, and beneath it, smaller, newer, carved with obvious care, the name Maggie. "A family isn't about replacing what you lost," Eleanor told her, crouching slowly, with Carol's steadying hand at her elbow. "It's about making room for what you find, without asking the old rooms to disappear to make space." Lily traced the carved letters with one finger, quiet for once in her life, then looked up at her father and Maggie standing together near the window, close enough now that their hands had begun, without announcement or ceremony, to simply stay joined most of the time. Outside on the porch, after dinner, Maggie and Ethan stood side by side looking out over the dark water toward the harbor, where all of this had started with a leaking sailboat and 31 questions from a 9-year-old girl. Neither of them said anything about the future. They didn't need to. Some promises are made in silence, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching the same water they had watched, separately, for most of their lives, before it finally occurred to either of them to watch it together. 6 months later, there were no chandeliers, no rented suits, no rooms full of people counting the seconds until someone said something worth repeating to their friends. The gathering took place at the boatyard instead. String lights strung between the workshop and the dock by Lily and Maggie together on a ladder Ethan kept insisting on holding steady, the harbor smelling of salt and fresh paint instead of expensive perfume and imported flowers. Walter and Patricia arrived early, no longer strangers to the smell of sawdust, no longer flinching at calloused hands offered in greeting. Eleanor arrived, leaning on Carol's arm as always, settling into a folding chair near the water. with the particular contentment of someone who has lived long enough to see a difficult thing through to an ending worth having. Richard Voss's name came up only once, in passing, in a quiet conversation about the ongoing investigation into the missing funds and the trial date set for the following spring, and nobody lingered on it, because there were better things to talk about now, and everyone in earshot seemed to understand that without being told, Ethan found Maggie near the end of the dock as the sun went down over the water. The same spot where he had once told her he used to build things bigger than boats, the same spot where she had once sat beside him in the dark and let silence say what neither of them was ready to say aloud. This time, he took her hand without hesitation, without the careful, testing pause that had once lived between them, and she let him, and neither of them looked away from the water turning orange and then gray as the light went. Lily ran past them toward the workshop, laughing at something Carol had said, her sneakers slapping against the dock boards, utterly unbothered by the fact that the two people she loved most in the world were standing exactly where they belonged. Finally, without anyone left to tell them otherwise, without a single person watching who thought their standing there together was anything but exactly right, neither of them had been looking.